So why refuge? Why refuge? I think first first things first is to recognize that we're all in a great sea change, and it's the current is really strong. The waves are really big, and if we're really honest, we're like a ship without a sail and without a rudder. Maybe even a captainless ship. And I think it's important to start a conversation on refuge with just what it subjectively feels like right now, just to be honest. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. It doesn't matter your political orientation. It doesn't matter your sexual orientation. It doesn't matter your level of education, your profession, nothing. I think one universal sensibility we can all agree on is that we are living through extraordinarily tumultuous times. And what that feels like is a sense of groundlessness, a sense of despair, a sense of absolute terror, and a sense of chaos in which we feel ill-equipped to deal. And I think that helplessness that comes with not having the right tool for the job, not being able to be effective, I think that strikes to the core of what the subjective, tangible sense of our experience on the planet collectively is like. And I think you have to start there. You have to start with your own personal experience of this. It can be a very microcosmic, it can stretch out to a macrocosmic sense, but I think that's the first place to start, is to get very honest. For me, that can be panic attacks. I've been a long time sufferer of panic attacks. And for the last few years, those panic attacks have been absolutely crippling, anywhere from the Monday morning before work. And the irony of me being a therapist having panic attacks is not lost on me. But it's part of this transparency of just like every human being in the recess of their own mind has this very personal experience. Maybe they're not broadcasting it, but we share that. And I would start Monday morning with a string of clients coming in feeling like I couldn't breathe, feeling like a sense of constriction, like the walls are closing in. And this was pre-pandemic. And I think now, flash forward in just a couple of years, we all feel boxed in as a result of the pandemic. And I think it's showing us that something hasn't worked or something is not working. And I think that's the good starting place. Where is your sense of despair? Where is your sense of alienation? Where is your sense of terror? Because that's what's prompting you to look for a solution. That's what's prompting you to look for refuge. If you have a good orientation, if you have a sail, if you have a rudder, if you have a good, capable captain, you have confidence. And you know where you're going. And even if the swell is coming, you know what to do. But I think we have to start with the premise, if we're going to really look into the notion of what refuge is to start with this helplessness. And so, we could take a big step back to answer that question, or start to bring in a multifactorial, multidimensional perspective on how did we get to this place of existential angst? How did we get here? Why is it that we don't have the internal resources? Why is it that we don't have a direction? Why is it that we've succumbed to a sense of being utterly debased? I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about is in the early part of the 20th century, both Friedrich Nietzsche and Carl Jung were talking about the time that we're living in is a critical moment, a constellation, if you will, a coming together of a genesis of several things that we have lost. And I just keep coming back to this image of a ship or a boat that's lost its rudder, it's lost its sail, its captain has been knocked overboard. something happened in our collective experience, at least in the Western world, where God is pronounced dead. We have come to the apex moment in the Western Europe called the Age of Reason, where we advance towards intellectual reason and dispense with the superstition of dogmatic religion, a necessary outcome of all of the crusades and all of the prejudice and hostility and hypocrisy of religion. Finally, we make it to this critical moment in history where man is essentially the captain of their own ship. We are not the center of the world. God has been displaced, and it's time to be intellectually clear and rational about how to move forward. And it marks a pivotal moment in time where we can then, make incredible technological advances. We send a man to the moon. We make incredible medicines and technologies, but then something gets left behind. Something is abandoned. Something that's necessary in the human experience is jettisoned. I speak about this often as like a mooring, something that tied us to some deeper truth that served as a balustrade for these moments of chaos and these moments of tumult. So the fact of the matter is, without God, there's no orienting principle for our psyche. And it displaces this connection, this fundamental connection with the unseen world of spirit. And so we have become hyper focused on the material world. We have been reduced to machines in a material world. Beautiful analogy is Rick Tarnas's explanation of this as the disenchantment of the world, the disenchantment of the world. The magic has been sucked out of the world. The spirit has been sucked out of the world. And all that has for millennia guided human beings has been jettisoned. And we get all the benefits, but we get also all the repercussions, all of the unfortunate consequences of this. So we have become too left brain, too mechanistic, too almost infatuated with reason, and we have lost this incredible capacity to deal with uncertainty as a result of it, and an incredible capacity to call on a whole dimension of life that is beyond or transpersonal, transmaterial, that connects us with a deeper source. So I think this kind of backdrop is really important to consider, because without it, you can't really go forward. I often talk about this in my opening conversations on my podcast. The question that I pose to people is, what does it mean to go back in order to go forward? And therein is almost a reference to refuge. It's like, what is it in our past that we've left behind that we need to reclaim in order to move forward? There's something about taking a moment of pause, doing an analysis, seeing that we don't have the tools that we need to survive this existential moment, and reverting back through history to see, where did we lose spirit? Where did we lose the soul? Where did we lose our connections with ancestors? Where did we lose our connections with wisdom keepers? Where did we lose our connection with the unseen world of spirit? A disconnection from our bodies, a disconnection from our intuition. These are the sources of refuge that would be so vital, necessary for us to reclaim in order to survive this sea change as we get closer and closer into the transition to a new paradigm.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I like looking at it from an individual level as well. Like when I ask myself, like, in this moment or in this suffering, this particular day, when I'm confronted with this particular trigger, where am I seeking refuge? Like, it's such a vital question for me, because so many times it's, I'm looking for it in feeling like I'm in control.
Yeah.
Control, which is power, or I'm looking for it in the love of someone else. I need their love to feel like I'm comfortable, like I'm safe.
Yeah.
And these are all things that are impermanent. They can be taken away very easily. So that's anxiety. So can you speak from like, if you want to take this in like a personal direction, or if you just want to speak more just generally, but like maybe there's that like anything that's the worldly
Yeah.
refuge
Yeah.
is not solid like a
Yeah.
rock.
I have a perfect example
Yeah.
for this. Yeah. Like the most salient and personal example of seeking false refuge comes from my father's experience and watching my father, master his universe and then face death. And I think it's a good microcosm. I think it's a good case scenario that is really relevant to our culture. I mean, my father's private life and his battle with cancer is, in a way, the everyday man, the everyday secular humanist, industrial world experience. It's something that anybody can relate to. My father didn't grow up with any religion of any sort. He was raised in Liverpool, England. He grew up in the time of the Beatles. He was a man that didn't finish high school. He was a self-made man. He worked his way into his industry or field. He became incredibly adept and skilled at what he did as a stockbroker and a commodities broker. He liked money. He liked the commercial world. He liked beautiful things. He was a man that dressed like really dapper. He enjoyed the purchasing of beautiful materials, and he was a man that took great pride in his appearance. He was a man that liked to travel. He would spend his time, and I was a recipient of this great fortune because we spent a lot of time traveling around the world, essentially having nice experiences, nice dinners, beautiful vistas, beautiful clothes, nice gifts. And I remember growing up feeling empty as a result. I mean, it may not have been that stark in the beginning. Of course, growing up as a kid, you like going on new adventures, and you like, toys brought back from you for Christmas from different parts of the world. But I remember also a kind of longing amidst that, not quite knowing what was missing. I think that people can relate to this idea of being on a commercial treadmill, being part of an institution or a corporation where we have been indoctrinated very early on to believe or to assume that what is meaningful in life is the advancement of one's career, the acquisition of possessions, the acquisition of wealth, the acquisition of validation from the world. And so we're set about on this trajectory, outward directed trajectory of trying to accumulate Facebook likes, nice words of admiration. Look at me. How am I doing? How am I going? Numbers and digits against our salary payouts. This is sort of the structure, implicit structure of what it means to be part of a modern secular society. This is the modus operandi. This is what makes us tick. And I think everybody at some point comes to face a crisis, an existential crisis of doubt. And that could come in a midlife crisis. You've acquired just about everything that you've had. You've had every kind of sexual pleasure, a wealth acquisition experience that there is to have. And you find yourself in some dark night with your head on the pillow, wondering, what else is there? What more is there? I'm feeling empty. I've chased and acquired and chased and acquired and chased and acquired, and some deep vacuous hole in my being, a black hole, never seems to get filled. For my dad, he was an extreme case scenario. He would have kept going, even past that midlife crisis. He would have kept going until what hit him was cancer. What it took to bring down the absolute rhino that my dad was cancer. Nothing else was going to stop him. He was a force of nature. He was a man, a very strong, strong-willed and physically strong man. He thought he was going to live forever. He was a one pack of Marlboro a day. He was a man who enjoyed his whiskey. He was a man who enjoyed his womanizing. He was a man that enjoyed his business opportunity. And then all of a sudden one day he was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And that's the moment. That's the moment where, for the first time in this individual's life, the rug is pulled out. The rudder is torn asunder. The sail and the mast are ripped apart. And I watched my dad. By then, by the time this happened, I was already an adult. I was already a trained therapist. I was both his son, but also someone who knew the inner terrain. And I watched him struggle with not being resourced for this moment that impacts all of us.
I wonder if we could just take a moment, because I know this is a long story. I'm sure there's a lot of information we could go into. Could you just take a moment and close your eyes and just sort of like bring yourself back to that moment when you were sitting with him when he passed? And if you could just tap into what you remember, what's just coming up, what's most present from that memory. Maybe it's sense memory, maybe it's just something that's completely not even a narrative. It's just like, what is that? What's still there in your body? And I wonder if you could just take a moment to just sort of feel into that and then speak from there and just whatever, see whatever comes.
You know, the day that my father died, he was at home in Turkey. I remember clearly that the sunlight was coming through the window. And no one knew he was going to die that day. I knew he was going to die. I knew he was going to die soon. I had been briefed and I had been prepared. My dad was still in denial. So the first thing that comes to my mind is denial. It was palpable. It was thick. Death is so big, and we are so ill prepared as a culture, that even the very day that he died, he was sure he was going to live. It started with him at the edge of the bed not being able to get up. And by the time he laid down, we, my brother and my wife and I in the room, entered into a kind of, I would call it a kind of non-temporal space, like maybe a flow state, or certainly it's like a spiritual experience for me. But for my dad, he was in utter denial, thinking this was just another bump in the road. He was going to have another day. And then the moment came where he, not to get too graphic, but his lung was filling with fluid and he was unable to breathe. And my dad was essentially drowning on his lung fluid. And I could see the terror in his eyes. And watching your father drown in your arms, you can't put words to that. But I knew deeply that he was terrified, and this was the end. It had just finally broke. The levee of denial had just finally broke. And in that moment of free fall, he was not ready. He was terrified. And that's the moment of refuge. That's what moment of refuge is all about. Those that are prepared can find their way through that transition. Those that are not prepared, they are totally lost. And that's the difference. That's the difference. So what happened in that moment, because of my training and because of my commitment to this internal work, I became my dad's refuge. I tried to offer him refuge. I was really present. I wasn't afraid. I had shifted my consciousness in some way that made me completely available to him without fear. I wasn't bringing any more fear to the party. I was actually bringing presence. I was stroking his hand. I was whispering in his ear, "Dad, you've done a great job. I love you. Thank you for everything that you've done. We will take care of Mom. Let go. Let go. You will be okay." And I really believed it. I really believed it. I really believed that that energy of confidence and the permission to release him from his utter sense of terror and grasping, that allowed him, that gave him permission to let go. And the last words that my father uttered before he slipped away were, "I see them. I see them. I see them." And I knew what he meant. That bardo transition, that gateway, which most of us have been conditioned or indoctrinated to believe is an abyss. It's an abyss. Is a throughway. It's a way station. And there, at the gates, were his parents, long since deceased. They're waiting to pick him up, like you and me wait at the school bus to pick up our children. And if we had that knowledge, if we knew that that was the case, if we had that sensitivity and that confidence and that security, can you imagine what these inevitable moments of our life would be like? And not just the big D deaths, but also, ironically, the small d deaths too that happen weekly, monthly, in a lifetime. How many of us have to surrender and lose and grieve and let go so that we can be reborn in a new moment, in a new relationship, in a new job? How many of us resist? How many of us feel helpless? How many of us feel powerless? How many of us feel angry? How many of us feel indignant? Adding fuel to the fire of a process that we have no control over. Lack of preparation, a lack of a holistic picture, a lack of sensitivity, a lack of community, a lack of embodiment. All of these make the death process, whether they're the big D death of this life or the micro deaths through a lifetime, they can be totally altered through training. Wow, beautiful. Yeah, so, wow. I wonder if there's a ceremony today. Maybe that's why.
They said they were getting ready for ceremony.
You think they're coming down here?
I don't know. But in case they do, let's switch over to, like, you want to transition in from that into your own, like, where it became visceral for you,
Yeah.
for the cancer,
Yeah.
of like being faced. Oh, okay, it's just someone else. It's still distant. Now it's me.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, we can start by saying, you know, it may be easier to be there for others than to be there for yourself. You know, I take a lot of pride that I was able to facilitate my father's death. It was a great return for me, a gift. My father gave me life. He raised me, brought me up, did the best that he could. I think we owe it to our parents and our elders to at least be there to facilitate their passing. And I thought I did a very successful job. It's something that I remember feeling like at least I was there so he wasn't alone. So he wasn't alone. But then it came time for my existential moment. And it's one thing to be there for another person. It's a completely different one to be there for yourself, to be in that predicament yourself. So my moment is, I found a lump. And I think people can identify with that moment. Whether it's a lump in your breast or a lump in your testicle or a lump or a tumor in your brain, it's the same existential moment. It's like your life is just moving along and these terrible things happen to everyone else, but then there you are, and it's you. And not only is it you, but it's you. You're the one that has studied Buddhism. You're the one that's been a therapist. You're the one that was a death doula for your father. And it's a very interesting story, the lump that they found for me and what happened to me, because it was benign, thankfully. But it was no less shocking and no less terrifying. And the qualitative feel of the diagnosis was that I was without control. I didn't know what to do. And that's the moment where you seek refuge. That's the moment you seek refuge. When you don't know what to do and you feel out of control and you feel helpless, you go for refuge. And what do we go for refuge in our culture when you find a lump? For most of our lives in our culture, when everything's going fine, we go for money as our refuge, validation for our refuge, praise and performance for our refuge. When shit hits the fan, where do we go for refuge? Our culture goes instantly to the doctors. And I guarantee you, the people out there that may be listening to this have had the experience of going to the industrial medical complex and being treated so inhumanely and without dignity that they feel a second injury. There's like an absolute breach in trust and confidence when you go in your most vulnerable state and are treated like a machine or cattle on a treadmill. I remember going and having a 15-minute conversation with somebody who really didn't register me, had no presence, was just sort of sweeping me through the system, and without even asking me all of that much about this lump, suggested surgery. And when I turned to him and said, what will happen after the surgery? Can it return? He said, the chances are good that it will return. And I'm thinking to myself, you're going to cut me open and remove this thing, and there's no guarantee that it won't come back. And therein lies the problem, which is we don't really know what the sources are. We're just attacking it from a mechanistic point of view and pulling it out. We don't really understand the origins of sickness. And we perpetuate this kind of mentality in our interactions with other beings. So it felt like a double dagger. And I was eventually able to find one or two specialists that were going to be able to address my situation without surgery, without anesthesia. But I want to talk about this moment between, which is critical in my story, which is my sense of despair and falling apart. Between the first doctor and the second doctor was about a 3-week period. And I basically decompensated. I went into a massive depression. I was terrified. I was having panic. I was having nightmares. I was not able to sleep. And anyone who knows what happens when you lose sleep, the whole circuitry just exacerbates itself. I remember taking my boy to the school bus and dropping him off. And when I walked home without my boy, I was in tears because it felt existentially that I was going to die and I would never see him again. And mind you, this is in spite of knowing that this mass was benign. What's going on with me? What's going on with me? Flash forward a few days later, I was able to really understand what was going on with me. It relates to my father. I remember having a nightmare, waking up in a cold sweat. It was a nightmare of me drowning. It was a nightmare of me drowning. And it dawned on me, drowning, choking, dying. Drowning, choking, dying. I had watched my father drown, choke, and die. And despite my presence and despite my sense that it was a spiritual, trans-temporal, transpersonal experience of being available and present, I still watched my father die. I still held him in my arms when he took his last breath, choking on fluid in his lungs. Somewhere in my being, the experience of that trauma had been fragmented and suppressed. And this moment of finding a mass had activated it. But I wasn't aware. I was still looking in real time. I was convinced it was about the mass. I was convinced it was about my life in real time. But having had that dream and having a very strong intuition, I was able to find a deeper source of the terror. I didn't want to go under anesthesia. I didn't want to die. There was fluid in this mass. There was fluid in my dad's lungs. I saw him choke. I was choking in my nightmare. I saw him die, and I didn't want to die. I didn't want to die. I wasn't ready to die. And despite all my training, almost 20 years of studying Tibetan Buddhism, all my years of meditation practice, all my years of psychotherapy, both giving and receiving, didn't matter a damn, if I'm completely honest. And that's the rude awakening. That's the moment of not having a sail, not having a rudder. You too are gonna die. Are you ready? And I was saying no with every ounce of my being. No, I'm not ready. I don't want to leave my kids. I don't want to go under. I don't want to fall into the abyss. So if that's me, that's every person's experience. Something like that is awaiting us. Whether it comes because someone else dies, whether it becomes because you lose a job, whether it comes because you find a mass, whether it comes because you fall off your motorcycle, it's just waiting like a landmine in Cambodia.
How do you want to transition into? I'm trying to figure what the psychedelic experience was for you and where that fit in. Was that kind of after
Yeah,
this?
that's the
Yeah,
first
that kind of,
resolution, and then the
and then
Guru
the
Yoga
guru
is the
is the
second.
second.
Yeah.
I mean, it's beautifully put. I mean, yeah, I mean, maybe we could come back. Let's go into that, and if there's something else, we come back. I just want to make sure we hit all,
Mm-hmm.
because you're just really rolling. I want to keep the energy going.
So keep going.
Yeah, let's go into that. Like, I mean, because for me, in my experience, that is actually touching death. It's dying before you die, you know.
Yeah.
So, I guess that's the piece, yeah.
Yeah. So there's a sub story, which is me finding the good doctor. I think is important. Mm-hmm. So we don't disparage the medical industry.
Yeah.
We there are good angels in there. Mm-hmm. I need to say that. Mm-hmm. But it ties. It's like I needed an outer and an inner medicine.
Right.
Okay with you?
Yeah. Yeah. Great.
You know, so based on this utter terror, I needed to find a remedy, which is where most of us are right now. We're looking for a remedy. That's what refuge is. The search for refuge is the search for safety. Where am I existentially safe? Where is my soul going to be protected? That's actually the best translation from the Tibetan tradition, from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition for refuge is, they call it the best protection for your mind, or safe passage, safe direction. Wow. What do they mean by that? So I'm amidst the industrial medical complex where there are trained mechanics treating me like a machine, dehumanizing me. I need a resolution to this physical mass in my body, like a needle in the haystack. I find one of two people in the entire United States that do a procedure that doesn't involve cutting, anesthesia, all of the bells and whistles. I fly across the country to meet Dr. Levine, and I'll never forget it. It's a beautiful thing because it shows that there are angels. There are angels. Dr. Levine met my wife and I at in his practice. He sat us down, he shook my hand, he paid attention to me. He wanted to know my story. He wanted to know my story. He wasn't top down telling me what he was going to do. He was receptive to me. He was giving me the respect and the grace of his presence. He wanted to know why I didn't want to go. I told him about my father. I told him about the medical industrial complex. I told him about the anesthesia and going under, the fluid, the collection, the lungs, the choking. He understood. He understood. And I can't tell you how simple things like grabbing my hand and saying, I'll take care of you. Don't worry. This will be quick. It will be painless. You won't have to go under. I'm sorry about your dad, and I understand. It may seem like a small thing, but for me, that actually was the medicine. Love, presence, kindness. So it almost served as a medicine on one level of my being, the physical realm where this mass existed. And after the procedure, it was a successful procedure. I'm forever grateful to that level of kindness. I know those kinds of people exist in every culture, in every industry. There are good people in corporations. There are good people in government. There are good people in the medical complex. It's up to each of us to be that one angel in whatever field of influence we have. We have to be that angel. It makes such a difference to be present, to be kind, to be thoughtful, to be receptive. But I still needed a deeper medicine for the existential fear. And I am not one who has messed around a lot with psychedelics. I take the psychedelics revolution that we're amidst as a archetypal symbol that we are transitioning towards a renaissance that is going to respect and facilitate unprecedented access and expansion of consciousness. That's where we are in this great sea change, where we are seeing societal decay, we are seeing structural collapse, we are seeing the tipping points of all these reinforcement contingencies between the ecology and economy. But something else is also happening amidst all of this. Just as things are getting very bleak and very dark, there are also signs of regeneration. And the psychedelic movement is exactly one of them, because it's showing that people can use plant medicines and go back into time, into ancestry, where these were used more traditionally by indigenous cultures as ways of going forward, as ways of healing, of ways of integrating, ways of connecting to all the fragments that we have cut ourselves off for, returning to nature, returning to the land, returning to our bodies, returning to spirit, returning to ancestry, are all facilitated by the psychedelic movement. And even still, I remain skeptical. I remain prudent. I was thinking to myself, I would like to do it under the right circumstances, with a lot of training, with a lot of thought, with the right mind and mindset and environment. I spent about 6 weeks preparing. And I found myself with my wife and another friend who were going to be my spotters, walking in a beautiful nature park in the United States. And I remember the medicine had kicked in, and I went off the trail. I left the girls behind. It was just me. And I remember finding this opening, and it looked like an amphitheater. And at the center of the amphitheater was a felled tree, single tree, long, with its bark gone. So it was like a white tree, smooth, long, laying across this sort of amphitheater-like area. And I remember seeing an unbelievable bull skull sitting right at the front of it. One of these pure white with the eye sockets and the snout and the horns. And I knew instantly, like, that archetype throughout cultures is an archetype of death and rebirth. Uh, the Greeks used it in their rituals. The shamans use it. It's also there in Tibetan Buddhism with the archetype of Yamantaga. The death destroyer is a bull-headed deity. The death destroyer. He who grants immortality. So there was the sign. It's like, you're going to die. You're going to rehearse death. You who are so afraid of death, what the medicine will show you is how to die before you die, so that you don't have to die. That was my motivation. That's my prayer. That was my aspiration. How do I deal with this existential fear of dying that my culture has indoctrinated me into and left me helpless with? Can the medicine help me? Can the medicine help me connect with a deeper refuge? So I found myself laying like a Christ figure on this cross. And the world dissolved, as only people who have experienced psychedelics know, into that temporal, like trans-temporal, timeless space. All your monologue, your inner chatter cease. Everything became like a panorama, like a kaleidoscope. And I felt myself melting, 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 deep, deep into the tree, and the tree into the roots, and the roots into the ground, and the ground opened into a very, very deep primordial space. And all there was for a moment was breath. I was just breathing. And then I heard my father's voice. And he said to me what I said to him in his passing moments, almost word for word. I'm there with you. Don't worry. You've done a good job. Let go. It was like the time between my father passing and my psychedelic experience was 10 years in literal time, but it was like we were just having a conversation. I had just helped him pass the threshold, and he was helping me pass the threshold. And what is so profound about the medicinal experience, even though I'm using a lot of words to describe it, is the visceral sense of safety that came up. This is what refuge really is that you feel safe enough to surrender. You have to go. You can go kicking and screaming and resisting, or you can let go like slipping into a warm bath. And the only thing that allows you to do that is to know that it's not terminal. It's not the end, and you're not alone. And it was beautiful. It was beautiful. I don't know how long I was there on that tree. I don't know what exactly took place after that, but for a while, I was bathing in a sense of surrender, in a sense of peace, in a sense of refuge. Here's a better word: deep rest. That's what it felt like. It's the difference between kicking and treading water and gasping for air and pushing and pushing and pushing, and that sense of deep rest when you hit the pillow and the bed is supporting you, and you can let go, like letting go into sleep, knowing you're going to wake up the next morning. And you get good, deep rest. And that's what it was like. Good, deep rest. I guess it's important to say that those really deep moments of surrender and this deep rest and this deep, profound experience of letting go, feeling comforted or reassured or supported under the psychedelic experience, they're also temporary. I mean, that's one thing we have to keep in mind. I mean, I didn't come out of that forever transformed and with unending amounts of confidence about my inevitable big D death. It gave me a very tangible, visceral touchstone, which is important because intellect isn't enough. Intellect is the problem. Intellect is the problem with our culture. That's the missing link. You cannot face death with your intellect. It doesn't matter how many books you studied or what someone tells you. You have to have an experience. And that is so true for what's missing in our culture across the board, not just about existential threats like death. We don't have enough right brain, intuitive, visceral, deep meditative or contemplative experiences. But those experiences have to be accrued and accultured. They have to be, the word in Tibetan is gom. It's a word that's translated for meditation, but it actually means familiarization. It means that not just once, not just twice, but repeatedly you have to have that sense of deep rest over and over and over again so that your guts, not your head, your guts, the fear that is in your guts since time immemorial through evolution, that deep-seated fear and grasping for life that comes through transgenerational networks, is slowly displaced by ongoing and repeated visceral experiences of profound letting go. So even though I had one psychedelic experience, and even though it was very profound, I would call it a breakthrough, I wasn't out of the woods. I wasn't out of the woods. So I needed to combine the psychedelics with my meditation experience so that every meditation I go through, I also remember the memory storage of the deep rest so that both of them are combined on a daily basis. So I remember about 6 months after my psychedelic experience, we were on pilgrimage. And I was with my teacher, Geshe Zopa, who is a profound Tibetan master, young but a great adept, comes from a lineage of intensive mountain hermitage retreat yogi, a modern day yogi. And we were in Varanasi. Varanasi is the single most continuously inhabited city on the planet. It is right there on the banks of the Ganges, the most sacred site in India. To be cremated at Varanasi is, they say, to be liberated right there and then, to gain moksha. It is one of the single biggest pilgrimage sites of all of India. And we were there in the holiest city on the holiest day. Diwali, the Day of Lights. And we were heading to one of two cremation grounds in Varanasi. So, I mean, this is an epic setting. Holiest city, the holiest day, and one of two holiest sites. And there are thousands upon thousands of people gathering to go down to the, what are called ghats, the stairs that lead down to the holy Ganges River. And it's pandemonium and chaos. And I'm following my teacher. It's just me and my teacher. I'm following him through what are called gullies, these little passageways and stairways and nooks and crannies that are leading through this ancient 4,000, 5,000-year-old city down to the Ganges, and millions of people and cows and buses and cars and police officers and cacophony of sounds and smells and sights, and my nervous system is just crumbling under the sensory overload. And my teacher, Geshe Tenzin Zopa, is like cutting like a knife through warm butter, hot knife through butter. And I'm following him, and I have this image in my mind that he's leading me into hell. He's leading me into the depths of hell. And like I often follow the mythopoetics of things. I look through life, I look at life through a mythological lens, an archetypal lens. And my teacher is leading me through these gullies of sensory overload down to the fiery pit of hell. And you might ask, why is your teacher doing that? Well, just like in psychedelics, you have to be careful what you wish for. You know, aspiration is very important. Every ceremony is started with intention. And the whole pilgrimage for me and the last years of my life, several years of my life, is about understanding death. That's what I've asked for. I want to know how to die well so that I can live well. And here's my teacher leading me into the depth of hell. And we make it through the gullies and onto the sacred cremation ground, the charnel ground, overlooking the banks of the Ganges. And there they are, the corpses on fire, being burnt on the pyres. And Geshe Tenzin Zopa is chanting mantras. He has refuge. He is refuge. There's no fear. There's no hesitation. There's no him. There's no the other. There's no separation. There's no mourning or grief or sadness. He has the quantum view. He's living from the quantum view. He knows that the only thing that he has to do is say the mantra, create the right vibration. What we're all doing, and the only power that we have, is what kind of water are we putting into the stream? What kind of water are we putting into the stream? He's got the vibration of compassion. He's got the Chenrezig mantra. And that's what he's delivering. Blessing. Blessing on the body for a transition. Blessing on the grieving family members. Blessing on the waters. Blessing for the animals in the waters. Blessing for all the people in this area. It's a constant rain of blessing. He's just a portal, a vessel. And I'm blown away on my body and through the sensory overload. I'm deeply impacted. I'm moved to tears at watching this sight. And eventually we move off to a side to a little inlet over the banks of the Ganges. The fire is in our we can see the fire, we can smell the smoke. But I have him in a very private moment. And I say, Geshe, I'm afraid to die. I'm afraid to die. And Geshe looks at me and says, there's nothing to fear. It's like checking into a hotel. You stay 1-2 nights and then you check out. And I got so furious. I was like, I don't need this shit. I probably said it a little more harsh than that. Then he gave the second analogy, just like changing your clothes. There's nothing to worry about. You change your clothes in the morning. And I grabbed his hand. I said, Geshe, I know all of that, but I'm fearful. I'm terrified to die here. Help me with this. And I was really forceful. I was in no mood for a sermon. And it cut through. I got to him. And he grabbed me back. And he said this. When you die, think of me, and I will be there for you. And I will help you through. you will not be alone. You will never be alone. Not just this life, but for every life, I will be there for you. I have goosebumps just recalling it. I will be there for you, not just this life, but for every life. And that's the medicine. That's the medicine. I don't have many good qualities, but one that I do have is called guru devotion. Guru devotion in the Tibetan tradition is the confidence in your teacher. More than the confidence in your teacher is the confidence in your teacher's realization that there is something truly transformed about them, not so that you can hang on their coattails, although there's nothing wrong with that. I'd rather hang on the coattails of someone who knows what they're doing than hang on the coattails of someone who doesn't know what they're doing. But the whole point of guru devotion is to yoke your own mind with the inner guru, to recognize that whatever is in the guru is also in you. And the confidence and the conviction that he embodied in that moment by saying, you can rely on me. You can rely on me. I will be there for you. Not just in this life, but in every life. What he was doing skillfully was he was using my only asset for my advantage. My only good quality is my conviction in him. He was turning it around like a boomerang and using it to my advantage. And I did believe. Just like the moment on the tree under the influence of psychedelics, where I had a very deep rest and a visceral experience of surrender and safety, I also had it without psychedelics, on the banks of the Ganges, with my teacher, based on my love and confidence in him, that he will be there for me, and that is enough. And what he said to me in that moment, where he knew he had touched the source in me, he had activated the source in me, the conviction, the refuge. He said this, he said, when you have guru devotion, everything is possible. When you have no guru devotion, nothing is possible. And I think that says it all. If we have that embodied, visceral connection to our own innate capacity for well-being, for love, for compassion, for deep rest, for liberation, anything is possible. Anything is possible. But without that deep, embodied, intuitive, visceral sense of our own innate capacity or quality, nothing is possible. And that's what refuge is, that's what guru devotion is, that's what a psychedelic experience affords, that's what a meditative experience affords, that's what a pilgrimage affords. All roads lead to Rome.
I don't even have to do anything. This is perfect. Yeah. I want to just. I had some other just questions I want to hit, and then maybe I'll come back. There's something about dissolving, allowing the dissolution. I mean, we talked before about the value of fully dissolving before reconstituting.
Yes.
Is there anything there you feel like ties in here?
Well, okay, so one thing that we can think about is that our indoctrination in the rationalist, empirical pursuit of productivity, of consumption, of fabricating our world, of creating a world, it hasn't paid dividends for the internal life. It's like we're building sandcastles at the shoreline. And once the sea tide comes up, we're at an impasse with our tools and our technology and our basically what I call a sickness of paradigm. The deficit of this worldview is that we don't have an inner source, an inner vitality, an inner knowing. We have plenty of intellectual ideas, plenty of certainty, but the tide always comes up and takes away the sandcastle. And what the Tibetans know and what the magicians know, the Western alchemy tradition knows, is that you have to let go of all of those structures. You have to let them dissolve. All of your ideas, all of your concepts, all of your blah, 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 which I completely admit I'm well capable of doing in hundreds of pages and hundreds of hours of talks and lectures. You have to let go of all those ideas because they're all concepts. They're all concepts. They're all pointers. And we get fixated to these pointers. We adhere to these pointers as if they are the real source or truth. And this is our biggest problem. It's too left-leaning. It's too in the direction of facts. It's too in the direction of data. It's too in the direction of certainty. And look what happened in the pandemic when you have sources of knowledge and facts and data and statistics that are incoherent or not complementary or contradictory. What happened to us? What happened to us when some people were saying that the vaccinations were good and other people were saying the vaccinations were deadly? Our source of refuge, knowledge, was not enough. Didn't provide the certainty that we're used to. The part of the alchemical process is to dissolve in order to reconfigure. Salve et coagula. The salve part is to allow all of that intellectual identity-making, identification, senses of certainty, all the ways that we're the props, the yoga blocks and balusters and the yoga belts that keep us up in the pose are mind-constructed fabrications. They have nothing to do with actual experience. And they have to be let go. They are propping up our identity. I'm a professor. I'm a psychologist. I'm a dad. I know this. I know that. And then the moment the seashore comes up and takes away the sandcastle is that moment where you're staring reality in the face and you're naked there. And that's the dissolving face. You can resist or you can let go. You can realize none of these things can help you. The only thing that can help you is your very being. Is your very being. That's what the moment of psychedelics points to. That's what the Guru Yoga moment points to, is it's not what you know. It's what you already are. It's what you already are. That's what Geshe Tenzin Zopa is, a human being walking around already knowing who he is. And I'm walking around like a chicken with my head cut off, not knowing, but thinking that I know who I am. So yes, you have to let go. You have to let all these identities dissolve. You have to become no one in order to find out who you really are. You have to let go of every edifice of preconceived refuge to find the deeper, inner, and sustainable refuge. And sometimes that comes in a big crash of the waves on the shore. Sometimes it's a little eddy or a little pool. But either way, you can either go kicking or screaming into death, and the same thing with the dissolution process. What you find at the tail end of the dissolution end of the pilgrimage of Salve or Coagula is that all the things that you have misunderstood yourself to be, you are not. And that is the cleaning of the slate. What is called in the alchemical traditions the prima materia, what is called in the Tibetan traditions the Dharmakaya, the body of selflessness, the body of truth. That is what you really are. That is not trainable. That is not indoctrinatable. You can't buy it. You can't sell it. It can't be bequeathed to you. It can't be given to you. Nobody can, do a mantra over you. That is what you discover for yourself at the tail end of the process of letting go, surrender, and dissolving. And the process is only half the arc. It's only half the cycle. Once you understand that you're not that person, that you're not a finite being, that you're not an identity, you're not an identity politic, you're not your name or your pronoun, you're not your body, you're not the clothes, you're not the PhD behind the fancy letters behind it, you're not a reflection of your society or your culture, you're none of these things. Then starts the onward journey home. All the things that you can be, driven by that deeper intuitive understanding of what you're not. The freedom. You are that freedom. You are an expression of freedom. That's what you are. And that can come in so many shapes and sizes.
I want to just keep this because pulling on this thread, you perfectly anticipate where I wanted to go with this. Like that moment, the dawning of Dhammakaya, like it's an opportunity. Is there like a reframing that happens there? That death is the great opportunity. That there is something there for, because I think when I look at every death in my life, there's always comes with an opportunity of realizing things for what they really are. You break up, you realize, oh, this is the truth. It's an opportunity for realizing truth. So do you feel like there's like that could be looked for not as something to just, I got to get through this and I need to seek the refuge, but something to actually practice toward realization?
So let's look at it this way. The Tibetans are the psychonauts of the death experience. They are, I'm sure that the Egyptians once had a very vast and intricate knowledge of death and rebirth, but sadly, we don't know much about that legacy. But the Tibetans are still around, and they still command our respect because they have invested much of their tradition in mastering the art of rebirth, conscious rebirth. And what they did skillfully was that they turned a mindless life cycle on its head. So most of us live with a compulsive birth, a mindless life, and a terrified rebirth or death. So we go birth, life, and death. Terminal, one life to live. You come into this world kicking and screaming, you live blindly and hoping for the best, and you die terrified, as evidenced by my father and my own experience. What the Tibetans did is that they turned it on its head, and they started with a conscious death. A sublime liminal space and a purposeful rebirth. Conscious death means surrender, dissolve. You're not this, you're not that. You enter into the bardo, the between. This is where they say you have the possibility to recognize Dharmakaya, what you really are. Most of us are not trained. I'm not trained. That's why I was afraid. So what happens to us in the between, they say, is that we're assailed by all our projections without knowing they're projections. We're assailed by our regrets. We're assailed by all our hostilities. We're assailed by all our greeds. We're assailed by the projections of all our identifications. They come boomeranging at us and terrify us. But they're made of mind. And the psychonauts know how to understand mind as mind. And they have this beautiful saying in the Tibetan Book of the Bardo Todol. Voidness cannot destroy voidness. Emptiness cannot destroy emptiness. What does that mean? In this liminal space, if you understand mind as merely a projection of mind, you have no fear there. You have nothing to destroy because there's nothing to fear. That changes everything. There's nothing to fear. It's mind created. Recognition is liberation. They also say that in the Bardo Todo. Recognition is liberation. Seeing mind and what it's doing itself is freedom from all your projections. And when you enter into the great transition and recognize mind, as Dharmakaya, the truth body, what you really are, then you have this opportunity. This is what you're talking about. In between painful death and compulsive rebirth, if we can recognize what we really are, we become like a magician. If everything is mind fabricated and you have accrued enough merit, goodwill, the love that Dr. Levine exhibited, if we can accrue that and we have this wisdom eye, we become magicians, we can become creators, we can become designers. That's what can happen in the liminal space. And if you don't believe yet in the multi-life chain, then think about it just in one life. If you let go of a terrible relationship and enter in to the between, knowing and willing to let go of your identifications and let go of your sense of hurt and let go of your sense of being a victim and let go of your sense of, well, your whole life is ruined, and instead you see it as an opportunity. You take all the energy invested in that victim stance and you bequeath it to your new mind construction for your next rebirth, for your next iteration, whether it be a next relationship, your next job, your next moment of life. You go in ready to create, not taking it so seriously, seeing it like a disposable artwork, a mandala that is constructed, consecrated, and then bequeathed to reality and let go again and again and again. So they say that you just ride the energy through death, bardo, and between. You just ride the energy of love. You just ride the energy of creation. And you don't get so attached or bound up in the eddies of holding on to the sandcastle at the shoreline, because you can never hold on to it. You can never hold on to it. What if we knew what we create? What if we knew who we were and that our creations were temporary and that we could just avail ourselves of the dance of creation? That's the invitation. Is it easy to do? No. Can you do it conceptually down? Probably you can do an approximation of it. What if you did it viscerally up as an experiment or laboratory with your life? I surrender. I recognize who I am. I recognize my vast power, potential to create. I bequeath this as a gift, a temporary gift on the world. I relinquish myself of any grasping at result, and I allow myself to go through that iteration after iteration after iteration after iteration. This is what they call enjoying the dance. I'm not there yet, but I think it's worth aligning. It's worth the rest or remainder of my life to try to align with that than the alternative, which is to hold on for dear life, feel completely helpless and victimized in the bardo, and then allow the momentum of all my habits in the prior life rebirth myself in a cycle of self-fulfilling prophecy. Listen, I don't think Dr. Levine was chasing accolades anymore. He had reached his apex of his career. He invented invented new novel techniques, published countless articles, trained a next generation of physicians. By the time I met him, he wasn't building sandcastles anymore. He wasn't building castles anymore. He was free to just meet me in that moment and be authentic, deliver compassion, not with some secret harboring of what's the result of my compassion. Will he like me? Will it earn me some credit? He's in the dance. And for him, it's enjoyable. For him, it delivers great satisfaction. Probably more satisfaction in that moment of presence, in that moment of merger, in that moment of love, than any accolade before in his prior career could ever achieve. So I want to end with a pithy reflection, which is that the pearl is in the oyster. The pearl is in the oyster. Joseph Campbell also had a similar reflection, which is that the cave that you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek. The thing that you fear most also holds the promise, whether it be the death of this life or an individual letting go or an individual surrender, where all our energies are marshaled towards resistance, holding on for dear life, pushing, averting the catastrophe, the great calamity of our own personal life. And this amidst the setting of the structural reboot of our civilization, with the collapse, the systemic collapse of all our institutions, the great calamity of civilization, there is also the very promise of the hope of regeneration. The pearl is in the oyster. The cave holds the treasure. Think about how much energy is expended to resist the cave. To resist the cave. And yet, the cave is the only place where we will find the treasure. Death is the only place where we will find the soul. The darkness, when it is at its pinnacle of the darkness, there we will find the light, and no other place. And no other place. It can be found no other place. So it is incumbent on each one of us to look there in the shadow, to look where we are most afraid, to go to the place we are most afraid. Because there we will find the pearl, there we will find the treasure, there we will reconnect with the soul. And that is the boon and the elixir that we have always been seeking. That is the journey home.